On August 19, 1942, in the dense jungle near Tivu Point on Guadalcanal, Second Lieutenant Genjiro Imi of the 8th Independent Anti-Tank Gun Company recorded in his diary the shock that many Japanese soldiers felt upon encountering American forces. Through the thick jungle of palm trees and vines, Imi and 916 other soldiers of Colonel Kono Ichiki's detachment had just landed from destroyers, completing a nighttime insertion. Japanese command had believed this would be the first step toward recapturing Henderson Field. They were told the Americans numbered only around 2,000, poorly trained, easily scared and softened by a life of luxury. Even Colonel Ichiki dismissed any concerns about waiting for reinforcements. "These are Americans," he said to his officers. "We will sweep them into the sea before sunrise." What none of these battle-hardened veterans of China and Southeast Asia knew was that they were about to face something unprecedented. In the history of the Imperial Japanese Army, they were not just facing defeat, which was unthinkable for soldiers who had known nothing but victory since 1937, but a thorough destruction of every tactical assumption, every strategic belief, and every ideological certainty that had defined the Japanese approach to war. The jungle itself would turn into an American weapon. The darkness, which had favored the Japanese throughout the war, would betray them. The overwhelming superiority in equipment, coordination, and firepower would break the myth of Japanese invincibility in close combat. This transformation began 2 weeks earlier, on August 7th, when 11,000 United States Marines from the 1st Marine Division stormed ashore at Lunga Point. The Marines were executing Operation Watchtower, the first American offensive in the Pacific War. Their mission seemed straightforward: seize the nearly finished Japanese airfield, establish a defensive perimeter, and hold until reinforcements arrived. However, they were about to face the longest and most brutal campaign in Marine Corps history up until that point, in an environment that would test their endurance to the utmost limits. Guadalcanal itself was a tropical nightmare. The island stretched 90 miles long and 25 miles wide, its interior dominated by mountains reaching 8,000 feet into the clouds. The coastal plain, where Henderson Field was located, was a mixture of swamp, jungle, and kunai grass, so thick that visibility often dropped to mere feet. The heat was stifling, and the humidity never dropped below 90%. Mosquitoes swarmed in clouds so dense that men breathed them in. Rivers and streams that appeared clear in reconnaissance photographs were teeming with parasites and disease. Malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, and tropical ulcers would eventually incapacitate more men than enemy action. Yet on the first morning, the Marines found the airfield largely undefended. The 2,200 Japanese construction workers and 600 naval troops had fled into the jungle, leaving behind equipment, supplies, and most crucially, the airfield itself. By nightfall on August 8th, American engineers were already working to complete the runway. They would name it Henderson Field in honor of Major Lofton Henderson, a Marine aviator killed at Midway. Within days, the first aircraft would land, and the island would become home to what would later be known as the Cactus Air Force. The Japanese response came quickly and dealt a devastating blow to American naval forces. On the night of August 9th, Vice Admiral Gonichi Mikawa led 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer in a brilliant surprise attack. The Battle of Savo Island became the worst defeat in United States Navy history. 4 heavy cruisers, USS Quincy, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and the British HMS Canberra, were sunk in less than an hour, and over 1,000 sailors died in the burning sea. The surviving Allied naval forces withdrew, taking most of the supplies that had yet to be unloaded. The Marines were left stranded, cut off, facing a reinforced enemy with only half their necessary equipment and food. What Japanese High Command failed to realize in those early August days was that Henderson Field had become the key to everything. Controlling the airfield meant controlling the seas around the island during daylight hours. Aircraft operating from Henderson could strike any Japanese ship within a 200-mile radius. This reality would shape the entire course of the campaign. While Japan controlled the night and could send troops and supplies via fast destroyers in runs known as the Tokyo Express, when daylight came, American aircraft ruled the skies. The strategic importance of retaking Henderson Field was clear to Japan. Imperial General Headquarters tasked Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake's 17th Army, based at Rabaul, with the mission. Hyakutake had limited forces at his disposal. The 35th Infantry Brigade, under Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi, was stationed at Palau, and the 4th Infantry Regiment was in the Philippines. The nearest unit was Colonel Ichiki's 28th Infantry Regiment, which had been stationed near Guam. This unit had been intended for the Midway operation that was cancelled after the Japanese naval disaster in June. Colonel Kona Ichiki, an infantry school instructor known for his tactical brilliance, was also famous for his impulsiveness and absolute confidence in the superiority of Japanese fighting spirit over American material power. Before departing Truk for Guadalcanal, Ichiki had been ordered to wait for reinforcements before attempting to retake the airfield. But Ichiki, who had little respect for American soldiers, disregarded those orders. He believed his troops were more than capable of overcoming any American resistance. Reports from China, the Philippines, and various other locations where Japanese forces had faced Western troops consistently noted that the enemy lacked discipline. They faltered under pressure, unable to match Japanese warriors in close combat. On the night of August 18th, 6 destroyers delivered 917 men from Ichiki's first element to Tew Point, 15 miles east of the American perimeter. The landing went smoothly, undetected by the American forces. Ichiki immediately dispatched reconnaissance patrols to assess the enemy's strength and defensive positions, a routine move that would prove fatal. On August 19th, a patrol from Company A, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, led by Captain Charles Brush, was moving along the coastal track toward Kohi Point when they spotted Japanese soldiers. The two forces collided in a brief but intense firefight. The Marines killed 31 Japanese soldiers and captured documents revealing the presence of a large enemy force in the area. More importantly, these papers showed that the Japanese had severely underestimated American strength. Captain Brush quickly returned to the perimeter with his intelligence. General Vandergrift immediately understood what was coming, likely a Japanese attack from the east. He ordered Colonel Clifton Cates to reinforce defenses along the sandbar at the mouth of the river, which the Marines had named the Tenaru River. In reality, the river was called the Ilu River, but the mistake would persist in all subsequent reports. Colonel Cates positioned Lieutenant Colonel Leonard Creswell's 2nd Battalion, 1st Marines, along the riverbank, with machine guns set up to create interlocking fields of fire across the sandbar. What occurred next became one of the most one-sided battles in Marine Corps history. Rather than waiting for intelligence from his lost patrol or reinforcements, Colonel Ichiki decided to attack immediately. On the night of August 20th, into the early hours of August 21st, he ordered a frontal assault directly across the sandbar. Japanese doctrine emphasized the superiority of spiritual strength and aggressive night attacks to overcome enemy firepower. Ichiki believed his veterans could break through American defenses with sheer audacity and close combat skills. Where Japanese soldiers excelled with bayonets and grenades, just after midnight, Solomon Island scout Jacob Vuza, who had escaped from Japanese captors after enduring hours of torture, stumbled into Marine lines and warned them that the Japanese were coming. Moments later, the attack began. Hundreds of Japanese soldiers charged across the sandbar, screaming battle cries, firing rifles, and hurling grenades. They ran directly into a killing zone the Marines had meticulously prepared. The M1917A1 Browning water-cooled machine guns began their devastating fire. These weapons, perfected during World War I, were unsung heroes of Marine firepower. Each could sustain 600 rounds per minute indefinitely, as long as the water jacket remained filled. The Marines had positioned the guns in mutually supporting positions, ensuring that no area of the sandbar remained unprotected. Japanese soldiers fell in waves as the heavy .30 caliber rounds tore through flesh and bone. Those who made it across the sandbar found themselves up against 37mm anti-tank guns loaded with canister rounds, effectively giant shotgun shells that shredded their bodies. The attack continued for hours, with wave after wave of Japanese soldiers charging into the machine gun fire. Some reached the Marine positions and engaged in hand-to-hand combat. Marines fought back with rifles, knives, fists, anything they had. But the defensive preparations held, and the interlocking fields of fire prevented any breakthroughs. As dawn approached, Colonel Ichiki's assault had completely stalled. More than 800 of his men lay dead or dying on the sandbar and in the shallow water. Daylight brought no relief for the survivors. General Vandergrift ordered a counterattack with elements of the 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. 5 M3 Stuart light tanks crossed the sandbar, hunting down Japanese soldiers hiding in the coconut groves. War correspondent Richard Tregascus, watching from a Marine position, described the scene. It was fascinating to see them moving amongst the trees, pivoting, turning, spitting sheets of yellow flame. We hadn't realized there were so many Japanese in the grove. Group after group was flushed out and shot down by the tank's canister shells. By midday on August 21st, the Battle of Tenaru was over. Of the 917 Japanese soldiers who had landed at Tew Point, approximately 800 were dead. Around 128 survivors, mostly from support units that had stayed near the landing site, melted into the jungle. They radioed the 17th Army headquarters to report the disaster. Among the dead was Colonel Ichiki himself, though accounts differ on how he died. The official Japanese version claimed he burned his regimental colors and committed ritual suicide, while some witnesses insisted he died leading a final charge. Marine casualties were around 40, with many more wounded. The psychological toll on surviving Japanese soldiers was devastating. Captured documents and post-war accounts revealed the shock of realizing that an entire regiment had been wiped out in a single night. The Americans had not fought in the manner Japanese doctrine had anticipated. They did not panic under the night assault. They did not break when charged by screaming warriors. Instead, they waited in prepared positions, allowed the Japanese to enter killing zones, and systematically destroyed them with concentrated firepower. The most devastating revelation came from analyzing captured equipment and assessing the battlefield. The Americans possessed a level of material strength that Japanese intelligence had completely failed to grasp. The Browning machine guns never jammed, never overheated beyond their designed limits, and never failed due to poor maintenance or lack of spare parts. Each Marine seemed to carry more ammunition than an entire Japanese squad. The artillery support available to the Marines far surpassed anything the Japanese could deploy. Additionally, the coordination between infantry, artillery, and even naval gunfire from ships offshore formed an integrated system of destruction that Japanese forces had never encountered. Within days of the Tenaru disaster, more Japanese reinforcements were already on their way to Guadalcanal. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto orchestrated a large-scale naval operation to support the next attempt to retake Henderson Field. On August 16th, 3 slow transport ships left Truk, carrying the remaining 1,400 soldiers from Ichiki's regiment, as well as 500 naval marines. However, after the Naval Battle of the Eastern Solomons severely damaged one of the transports, Japanese command decided to abandon the use of slow transport ships entirely. Instead, they turned to destroyers for what would become known as the Tokyo Express runs. Between August 29th and September 4th, various destroyers and light cruisers successfully delivered nearly 5,000 troops from Major General Kawaguchi's 35th Infantry Brigade to Taivu Point, the Bisu. Tokyo Express proved to be a highly effective method of troop transport. Destroyers could make the round trip from the Shortland Islands to Guadalcanal in a single night, minimizing exposure to American air attacks. However, this method had a critical flaw. Heavy equipment could not be transported this way. Artillery pieces, tanks, trucks, and most importantly, sufficient food and ammunition had to be left behind. This logistical limitation would ultimately doom every Japanese offensive on Guadalcanal. Soldiers arrived with only what they could carry, relying on local foraging and whatever supplies they could smuggle through American lines. As the campaign progressed, Japanese troops were not only fighting against American firepower, but also struggling against starvation. General Kawaguchi set September 12th as the date for his assault on Henderson Field. His plan involved a three-pronged attack. One force would strike from the west along the coastal area. Another would attack from the south, advancing through dense jungle to hit what Japanese intelligence believed was the weakest point in the American defenses. Kawaguchi himself would lead the main effort from the south, advancing along an inland ridge that overlooked Henderson Field. What Kawaguchi did not know was that Marine intelligence had already identified this ridge as the most likely route of attack. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson, commander of the 1st Raider Battalion, conducted a raid on Tasimoka village on September 8th and discovered massive supply dumps, indicating a large Japanese concentration in the area. Edson immediately understood the Japanese plan. They would approach from the south, using the ridge as their path. He requested permission to establish a defensive line on the ridge itself, which General Vandergrift approved. On September 10th and 11th, Edson positioned about 840 Marines from his raiders and the 1st Parachute Battalion along the ridge. He selected defensive positions with the same meticulous care that had characterized the Tenaru defenses. Machine guns were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire. Mortar crews registered on likely approaches, and artillery from the 11th Marines prepared defensive fire missions. Every advantage of terrain and firepower was calculated and utilized. The ridge itself was a narrow coral spine, about 1,000 meters long, with 3 distinct hills covered in kunai grass and scattered trees. Deep ravines bordered both sides, heavily wooded and at times nearly impenetrable. It was perfect terrain for a night attack by infiltrating infantry, but if properly defended, it was also a killing ground. On the night of September 12th, Kawaguchi's forces began their assault. Unlike Ichiki's frontal charge, this attack was more sophisticated. Japanese infantry infiltrated through the ravines on both sides of the ridge, attempting to envelop American positions. Small units probed for weaknesses, and when they found them, larger forces concentrated for breakthrough attempts. The fighting was brutal and chaotic. In the darkness, Marines often found themselves in hand-to-hand combat with Japanese soldiers who had infiltrated to grenade range. But the defensive preparations held. When Japanese forces concentrated for breakthroughs, Marine mortars and artillery shattered their attacks. The 11th Marines fired over 2,000 rounds during the night, launching high-explosive shells so close to Marine positions that some shrapnel wounded friendly troops. Machine gun crews fired until their barrels glowed red from the intense heat. Individual Marines fought with rifles, pistols, knives, entrenching tools, anything at hand. Sergeant Major Jacob Vare, the same scout who had warned about the Tenaru attack, moved through the lines, encouraging Marines and pointing out Japanese infiltration routes. Sergeant John Basilone manned a machine gun position that became critical to the defense. After his gun crews were killed or wounded, Basilone continued to fire alone, repelling wave after wave of Japanese assaults. He would later receive the Medal of Honor for his actions that night. 2 Marines would earn the Medal of Honor at Edson's Ridge, and 19 others would receive the Navy Cross. By dawn on September 13th, the Japanese attack had failed to break through, but Kawaguchi still had more troops available and was preparing to renew the assault the following night. Edson withdrew his lines to the center of the ridge, consolidating his forces. General Vandergrift sent reinforcements, increasing the defending force to about 2,500 men. The Japanese would attack again, But this time, the Marines were ready with even stronger positions and more concentrated firepower. The second night's fighting was even more intense than the first. Kawaguchi threw all his remaining forces into desperate attempts to break through, before American reinforcements made the position impregnable. Japanese soldiers charged repeatedly, dying by the hundreds under a hail of machine gun fire. Some attacks came within 50 yards of Edson's command post before being stopped. At one point, the situation became so dire that Edson himself grabbed a rifle and joined the firing line. But again, American firepower and defensive preparation held. By dawn on September 14th, Kawaguchi's offensive had completely collapsed. Japanese casualties were staggering, with around 830 to 850 soldiers dead on and around Edson's Ridge. Marine casualties were approximately 104 killed and over 200 wounded across the Raider and Parachute battalions. The ridge, which would forever after be known as Bloody Ridge or Edson's Ridge, became a symbol of the effectiveness of American defensive doctrine. For the surviving Japanese soldiers, the battle marked another profound shock to their understanding of warfare. Captured diaries and post-war accounts consistently reflected the same realization. Japanese forces had expected to fight other infantry in the dark, where their training and spirit would prevail. Instead, they faced artillery, machine guns, and mortars, all concentrated with precision they could not match. American commanders knew the Japanese were coming. They prepared killing zones. They waited for the Japanese to enter. Then they destroyed them with coordinated fire support. The battles at Tenaru and Bloody Ridge set patterns that would repeat throughout the Guadalcanal Campaign. Japanese forces would continue to launch attacks based on courage, night tactics, and close combat expertise. American forces, in contrast, would use their superior firepower and preparation to break every assault. The Americans would respond with overwhelming firepower, coordinated combined arms operations, and meticulously prepared defensive positions designed to maximize their advantages. The result was inevitable. Japanese casualties would be catastrophic, while American casualties, though significant, remained sustainable. However, numbers alone cannot capture the full horror of jungle warfare on Guadalcanal. The environment itself became an unyielding force that claimed lives indiscriminately. Malaria infected nearly every man who spent more than a few weeks on the island. By December 1942, the 1st Marine Division reported over 8,000 malaria cases. Tropical diseases disabled roughly 2/3 of the division. Dysentery was widespread. Men suffered from fungal infections that ate through their skin, and jungle rot caused open sores that refused to heal in the suffocating humidity. Dental problems, with no means of treatment, led to abscessed teeth and systemic infections. The Japanese suffered even more. From the outset, their supply situation had been dire. Soldiers were supposed to receive field rations, but the Tokyo Express could rarely deliver enough. Troops survived on whatever they could forage, supplemented by occasional rice deliveries that were stretched to the limit. Starvation became a constant companion. Medical supplies were almost non-existent. Quinine, essential for malaria prevention, ran out quickly and was never replenished. Wounded soldiers often died from infections that would have been easily treatable with proper medical care. Captured Japanese documents from later in the campaign painted a grim picture. A medical officer's report from late October noted that over 60% of the 17th Army's forces on Guadalcanal were incapacitated by disease or malnutrition, with combat effectiveness dropping to only 30% of their authorized strength. Soldiers were dying at a rate of 50 per day, mostly due to starvation and disease rather than combat wounds. American supply ships, protected by aircraft from Henderson Field during the day, regularly delivered food, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement equipment. Shortages did occur, particularly in August and early September, when naval defeats temporarily cut off the Marines, but these were brief. By October, the flow of supplies had become steady. Marines ate canned rations that, while unappetizing, provided sufficient calories and nutrition. Ammunition was plentiful enough that machine gunners could fire until their barrels wore out, then request replacements. Medical care included field hospitals with surgical capabilities, plasma for blood transfusions, sulfur drugs for infections, and the evacuation of serious cases to rear area hospitals. In contrast, Japanese logistics were limited to whatever could be carried on destroyer decks or smuggled through American lines. Soldiers learned to make a single rice ball last an entire day. Ammunition was so scarce that orders often restricted fire to only when absolutely necessary. Medical care meant a bandage if one was fortunate, amputation without anesthesia if unlucky, or death if wounds became infected. Seriously wounded soldiers were often given grenades and told to commit suicide rather than burden their comrades or risk capture. In late October, the Japanese launched their largest offensive of the campaign. General Hyakutake arrived in person to command the operation, bringing elements of the 2nd Division, including experienced troops from China. The plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, with the main assault coming from the south through dense jungle similar to the Bloody Ridge approach. However, this time, Japanese forces had more men, better coordination, and artillery support that had finally been delivered via destroyers. The offensive began on October 23rd with a preliminary attack from the west. 9 Japanese tanks, rare on Guadalcanal due to the difficulty of transporting them, led an assault across the Matanikau River. American defenders, including elements of the newly arrived 164th Infantry Regiment from the American Division, were ready. Anti-tank guns, artillery, and even an M3 Stuart tank knocked out all 9 Japanese tanks in quick succession, causing the attack to collapse with heavy casualties. The main assault came on the night of October 24th to 25th. Approximately 5,600 Japanese troops under Major General Yumio Nasu attacked from the south, aiming to break through American lines south of Henderson Field. They faced the 1st Battalion, 7th Marines, under Lieutenant Colonel Louis Chesty Puller, reinforced by elements of the 164th Infantry Regiment. The fighting that night would become legendary in Marine Corps history. Japanese attacks came in waves throughout the night. When individual breakthroughs occurred, they were immediately countered by Marines. Machine gunners fired until their weapons failed, then grabbed rifles and continued to fight. Artillery from the 11th Marines conducted danger-close missions, landing shells within yards of Marine positions. Offshore, the battleship USS Washington stood ready to provide naval gunfire support if needed. At one critical moment, only a single Marine battalion stood between the Japanese and Henderson Field. But they did not break. Sergeant John Basilone, who had already earned distinction at Bloody Ridge, once again played a pivotal role in the defense. When ammunition ran low for his machine gun section, Basilone personally carried supplies through enemy fire to keep his guns operational. He repaired damaged machine guns under fire. When one position was overrun, he grabbed a .45 pistol and led a counterattack to restore the line. By dawn on October 25th, the Japanese offensive had collapsed. General Nasu was killed by machine gun fire during one of the night attacks. More than 2,000 Japanese soldiers had died in their attempt to break through. American casualties were heavy, several 100 killed and wounded, but they were still sustainable. October 1942 also saw significant naval engagements that decisively shifted the balance of power around Guadalcanal. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal, fought over 4 days from November 12th to 15th, included some of the most intense surface combat in naval history. In a chaotic nighttime battle on November 13th, American cruisers and destroyers engaged a Japanese bombardment force, which included the battleships Hii and Kirishima. Rear Admirals Daniel Callahan and Norman Scott, the only 2 American flag officers killed in World War II surface combat, died in the fighting. The Americans lost 2 light cruisers and 4 destroyers, while 3 more destroyers were damaged. However, the Japanese lost the battleship Hiei, which had been disabled in the night action and later sunk by aircraft the following day. More importantly, the bombardment mission failed. Henderson Field remained operational. On the night of November 14th to 15th, the battleship Kirishima attempted another bombardment, but was intercepted by the USS Washington and USS South Dakota. In a devastating display of American radar-directed gunnery, the Washington hit Kirishima with 9 16-inch shells at ranges so far that Japanese lookouts could barely see their target. Kirishima sank with heavy casualties. Perhaps most significantly, American aircraft and surface ships destroyed a Japanese convoy attempting to land the 38th Division with heavy equipment. Of the 11 transport ships, only 4 reached Guadalcanal, and these were destroyed by aircraft and artillery before they could fully unload. Japanese casualties from the convoy attack exceeded 5,000 men. This marked the last serious attempt to reinforce Guadalcanal with a large, properly equipped ground force. For Japanese troops already on the island, November marked the beginning of the end. They had expected reinforcements and resupply, but instead they learned that the naval battles had failed, that the convoys had been destroyed, and that no more help was coming. Rations were reduced again. Already starving men were told to survive on even less. Medical supplies that had been critically short became non-existent. The sick and wounded filled makeshift field hospitals where doctors could only watch as men died. Captured Japanese diaries from this period described the slow collapse. Entries spoke of rice rations reduced to 1 ball per day, the spread of disease and bodies being burned when soldiers had the strength. Men were eating grass and bark, dying from poisonous plants, and degenerating into desperate, starving shadows. By December, the final reckoning had arrived. Japanese command at Rabaul made the decision to evacuate Guadalcanal. While they could not publicly admit defeat, they privately acknowledged that continuing the operation meant the complete destruction of the 17th Army. Of the 11,000 Japanese soldiers remaining on the island, down from a peak strength of 36,000, perhaps 7,000 were fit enough to walk. The rest were sick, wounded, or so weakened by starvation that they could barely crawl. The evacuation, designated as Operation K, would become one of the most successful Japanese operations of the war. Using destroyer runs similar to the Tokyo Express, Japanese naval forces managed to extract 10,752 men over 3 nights in early February 1943. While this was a remarkable achievement under difficult circumstances, it did little to mask the scale of the defeat. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal had reached a peak strength of about 36,000 personnel, with roughly 25,000 to 30,000 casualties, 14 T-800 killed in combat, and 10,000 to 15,000 from disease and starvation. American casualties were also heavy but manageable. The Marines and Army units fighting on Guadalcanal lost approximately 1,600 killed in action, 4,200 wounded, and several thousand more temporarily disabled by tropical diseases. However, American industry and manpower could replace these losses. New divisions were already in training, and ships and aircraft were being produced faster than they could be lost. The strategic initiative had permanently shifted. The psychological impact of Guadalcanal on Japanese military thinking cannot be overstated. For the first time, Japanese forces had been defeated in sustained ground combat. Every offensive had failed. Every attempt to apply traditional Japanese tactical doctrine had resulted in catastrophic casualties. The revelation that American forces were not only materially superior, but also tactically competent, well-led and capable of enduring terrible conditions, shattered pre-war assumptions. Japanese officers who survived Guadalcanal and later wrote memoirs or were interviewed after the war consistently emphasized several key themes. First, they had completely underestimated American fighting capabilities. Second, the disparity in equipment and supplies was far greater than intelligence had indicated. Third, Japanese logistics were fundamentally inadequate for sustained operations against an enemy that controlled both the sea and the air. Fourth, Spiritual power and tactical skill proved insufficient when facing overwhelming firepower and resource shortages. Post-war accounts from Japanese veterans revealed a consistent understanding of their defeat. They had believed in their superiority as warriors, trained harder, accepted death more readily, and mastered night fighting and close combat. But on Guadalcanal, they learned that war is ultimately decided by systems. The Americans had systems for everything: supply, medical care, artillery support, air coordination. Each one functioned seamlessly. In contrast, Japanese systems failed because they were never properly developed in the first place. Japanese veterans who survived the campaign and were later interviewed provided detailed accounts that contradicted official Japanese explanations for their defeat. They acknowledged that American forces fought superbly at night, especially when defending well-prepared positions. They admitted that Americans endured malaria, dysentery, and the terrible conditions of the jungle while maintaining combat effectiveness, all due to logistics that supported them. They recognized that American firepower was overwhelming, coordinated, and precisely delivered. A single American battalion had more effective firepower than an entire Japanese regiment. The technical aspects of American superiority were starkly evident. Japanese forces on Guadalcanal fought with Arisaka rifles, bolt-action weapons that required manual cycling between shots. American Marines initially carried M1903 Springfield rifles, also bolt-action, but supplemented by the M1 Garand semi-automatic rifle as these became available. The Garand's 8-round capacity and semi-automatic operation provided a clear advantage in firefights. The disparity in machine guns was even more decisive. The American M1917A1 Browning, a water-cooled machine gun, could sustain fire indefinitely as long as water and ammunition were available. In contrast, Japanese machine guns, primarily the Type 96 and Type 99, were lighter and more portable, but lacked the ability to sustain fire. In defensive positions, this difference was crucial. The superiority of American artillery was perhaps the most significant factor. The 11th Marines operated M1A1 pack howitzers, 75mm weapons that could be broken down and transported through jungle terrain, offering responsive and accurate fire support. Forward observers with infantry units could call for fire missions, receiving rounds within minutes. Japanese artillery on Guadalcanal was limited, difficult to move through dense jungle, and chronically short of ammunition. Naval gunfire added another dimension that Japanese forces could not match. Destroyers and cruisers offshore could deliver bombardments on Japanese positions or provide responsive fire support for Marine ground units. Radio communication between shore-based observers and naval ships allowed for precise targeting. Air power became increasingly dominant as the campaign progressed. The Cactus Air Force, operating from Henderson Field under difficult conditions, gradually established air superiority over Guadalcanal. Marine and Army Air Force pilots flying F-4F Wildcats, P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks intercepted Japanese bomber raids. SBD Dauntless dive bombers struck Japanese positions, supply ships, and troop concentrations. Japanese air forces based at Rabaul had to fly at the extreme limits of their range, limiting their time over target. The final American ground offensive in January 1943 demonstrated how completely the balance had shifted. Major General Alexander Patch's 14th Corps, now including both Marine and Army divisions, launched coordinated attacks that systematically reduced the remaining Japanese positions. This offensive was supported by overwhelming artillery, air power, and naval gunfire. Japanese resistance, though determined, was hampered by starvation, disease, and shortages of ammunition. On February 9, 1943, American patrols discovered that Japanese forces had evacuated. General Patch sent his famous message to Admiral Halsey: "Tokyo Express no longer has terminus on Guadalcanal." The campaign was over, 6 months of fighting had resulted in the first major American ground victory against Japan. More importantly, it established patterns and revealed truths that would shape the remainder of the Pacific War. The lessons learned by Japanese survivors from Guadalcanal were devastating to pre-war military doctrine. The myth of Japanese warrior superiority had been shattered. Individual courage and tactical skill proved inadequate against systematic disadvantages. Night attacks and close combat, hallmarks of Japanese tactical success in China, failed against American defensive positions. Supply and logistics were not secondary concerns, but fundamental requirements for sustained combat. Air and naval superiority ultimately determined the outcome on land. These hard-learned lessons from Guadalcanal should have prompted a fundamental reform in Japanese military thinking. Some officers did recognize these truths, but for many, the entrenched belief in their warrior superiority persisted. Colonel Masanobu Tsuji, a Japanese staff officer who visited Guadalcanal during the campaign, later wrote that Japan needed to completely reassess its strategy. He observed that the Americans were fighting an industrial war where material production determined the outcome. Japan, he noted, could not win an industrial war against America's overwhelming productive capacity. However, Japanese military culture, rooted in generations of tradition and recent victories, could not easily accept such a fundamental revision. The official explanation for the failure at Guadalcanal focused on inadequate supplies, naval defeats, and the unexpected strength of American defenses. It failed to recognize that Japanese tactical doctrine itself was flawed, and that the entire concept of warfare, which had worked against China, was obsolete when facing a modern industrial power. Those Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal, or who later became prisoners of war, witnessed a transformation they had never anticipated. They entered the campaign as confident warriors of an invincible empire, but left as starving, disease-ridden survivors of a catastrophic defeat. Many later described Guadalcanal as the moment they first realized Japan would lose the war. Post-war testimonies from Japanese veterans captured this psychological shift. They acknowledged painful truths that had been hidden from them. The Americans were not weak, but overwhelmingly strong, not only in weapons, but in organization, logistics, leadership, and the ability to sustain combat operations. While Japanese forces fought with courage and skill, it simply did not matter. American forces fought with systems and resources that Japanese forces could not match. From the American perspective, the lessons learned at Guadalcanal were different. For Marines and soldiers who fought there, the campaign proved that American forces could match Japanese troops in the brutal jungle combat for which Japan was known. The myth of Japanese invincibility was shattered. American defensive doctrine worked, and combined arms coordination proved effective. Individual American soldiers, properly trained and equipped, were more than capable of defeating Japanese forces. However, Americans also came to respect their Japanese counterparts as tough, determined, skilled adversaries who would fight to the death rather than surrender. The willingness of Japanese forces to continue attacking in the face of hopeless odds, to endure starvation rather than give up, and to die rather than retreat left a profound impact on the Americans. The contrast in approaches to prisoner welfare and surrender illustrated fundamental cultural differences. American forces made efforts to encourage Japanese surrender, dropping leaflets, broadcasting radio messages, and offering medical care and food to prisoners. These efforts, however, had limited success. Of approximately 36,000 Japanese troops who served on Guadalcanal, fewer than 1,000 were captured alive, and most of those were too sick or wounded to resist. The strategic implications of Guadalcanal extended well beyond the island itself. Japan's failure to retake Henderson Field and the eventual evacuation demonstrated that the Japanese defensive perimeter could be breached. Allied strategy shifted from defensive operations to offensive campaigns. The industrial and material advantages of America could be transformed into military victories if applied systematically. For Japan, Guadalcanal marked the beginning of the end. The loss of experienced troops, pilots, and ships could not be replaced at anywhere near the rate at which America was producing new forces. The decision to evacuate, however quietly, admitted that Japan could not sustain an attritional war against American industrial might. The veterans of Guadalcanal, on both sides, carried their experiences for the rest of their lives. American Marines and soldiers who survived the campaign became instructors for new units, passing on the hard-won lessons of jungle warfare, defensive tactics, and combined arms coordination. The 1st Marine Division, after pulling off Guadalcanal in December 1942, required months of rest and rehabilitation before returning to combat. Japanese survivors faced an even bleaker future. Those evacuated during Operation K were dispersed to other units across the Pacific, carrying with them the psychological weight of defeat and the knowledge that American forces were far more formidable than they had ever been led to believe. Many of them would die in subsequent battles as Japan's strategic position continued to crumble. The island of Guadalcanal itself bore the scars of 6 months of intense combat for decades afterward. Wrecked aircraft, destroyed vehicles, abandoned equipment, and unexploded ordnance littered the jungles and coastal areas. Henderson Field, expanded and improved during and after the campaign, served as a major Allied base for subsequent operations in the Solomons. For military historians and strategists, Guadalcanal became a key case study in amphibious operations. Jungle warfare, logistics, air-ground coordination, and the integration of naval power with land operations. The campaign demonstrated that modern warfare required more than just brave soldiers and tactical skill. It demanded industrial capacity, effective logistics, technological superiority, and the ability to sustain operations over extended periods. The human cost was immense, but the lessons learned from Guadalcanal shaped the course of the Pacific War and the broader understanding of modern military conflict. The human cost of Guadalcanal was staggering on both sides. More than 7,000 American and Japanese servicemen lost their lives in the naval battles around the island. On land, American casualties exceeded 7,000, including those killed, wounded, or missing. Japanese losses surpassed 30,000 due to combat, disease, and other factors. Thousands more from both sides suffered from diseases and conditions that would affect their health for the rest of their lives. Despite the immense cost, the strategic significance of Guadalcanal justified the sacrifice. Guadalcanal marked the turning point where Allied forces transitioned from defense to offense in the Pacific. It proved that Japan could be defeated in ground combat and set the stage for air and naval superiority patterns that would shape the rest of the war. The confrontation between Japanese and American troops on Guadalcanal was a clash of two fundamentally different approaches to modern warfare. One side placed faith in the supremacy of the warrior spirit, believing that courage could overcome material disadvantages and that tactical brilliance would secure victory regardless of resources. The other side believed in the systematic application of industrial power, using logistics, firepower, and combined arms coordination as the key to success. The jungle of Guadalcanal became the testing ground where these opposing philosophies collided. The outcome, though it took 6 months of brutal fighting, showed that concentrated fire support and effective logistics, when combined with solid tactics and determined soldiers, formed a military power that Japanese forces simply could not match. For the Japanese soldiers who survived Guadalcanal and lived to tell their stories, the campaign marked the moment when reality shattered their illusions. They realized that their training had been based on false assumptions, their tactics designed for a different kind of war, and their logistics inadequate from the start. They also learned that Japan was engaged in a conflict it could not win through military means alone. For the Americans who fought on Guadalcanal, the lessons were equally important. They discovered that they could match Japanese soldiers in the brutality of combat. They proved that American industrial power could be translated into military victory. They developed tactics and doctrines for jungle warfare that would serve them well in future campaigns. Most importantly, they shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, replacing it with a realistic view of a tough, determined, yet ultimately defeatable enemy. Guadalcanal was where Japanese troops came to fear not just the American soldiers as individual fighters, though they proved formidable, but the systematic, overwhelming application of firepower and material resources that the Americans brought to every engagement. The terror Japanese forces felt did not stem from fear of death, something they had been trained to accept, but from the realization that courage and sacrifice were meaningless. Against an enemy whose supplies were inexhaustible, whose wounded received care, whose artillery never ceased firing, whose aircraft controlled the skies, and whose industrial base could replace losses faster than combat could inflict them, the transformation that began when Japanese forces first encountered American jungle warfare on Guadalcanal marked a pivotal shift in the Pacific War. From that point forward, Japanese forces would be on the defensive, engaged in a losing struggle against an enemy whose material advantages grew ever larger with each passing month. The jungle warfare of Guadalcanal became the blueprint for future campaigns, proving that American forces could fight and win in the harshest terrain against a determined foe, provided they had adequate logistics, effective coordination, and overwhelming firepower.